Thank you everybody for coming today. My name is Matthew Sorolla. I'm an assistant professor in the Toulouse Business School. And I'm joined today with four people who really need no introduction in this area, but we're gonna do it anyway. First, we have the Rubin Chair in Sustainability and Business, Director of the Pentland Center for Sustainability at Lancaster University, Jan Bebbington. Catedrático de Contabilidad en el Grupo de Investigación, Contabilidad, Cambio y Sociedad, Universidad de Burgos, Carlos Laranga. Director of Lloyd's Banking Group Center for Responsible Business at the University of Birmingham, Ian Thompson. And Professor of Accounting at the Allianz Manchester Business School and the University of Amsterdam Business School, Brendan O'Dwyer.
Well, quite simply, Routledge asked us if we would write something. And so, like many scholars who'll be watching this, if somebody asks you to do something and it sounds really worthwhile and it sounds important, and if you get to do it with great people, then saying yes is quite easy. So if you like, that was the motivation. And the Kia on the front I can claim credit for. We were trying to look for, we were told that we should go and look at a bunch of pictures and decide what to use. And a lot of them were quite sort of, you know, twee and sort of classic environmental pictures. And because we didn't want this to be a very classic environmental accounting handbook, but a bit more exciting, I thought, well, why can't we have a Kia? And they weren't very, they didn't promise to do it, but I was amazed they did, and absolutely delighted, because the Kia is endangered. It's a very naughty bird, but it's a very curious bird. And I like to think that these three colleagues, and include yourself in that as well, are both inquisitive, naughty, ambitious, and hopefully taking flight in the world.
I'd like to say there was a grand plan at the very beginning that we all had in our head that we were kind of going to work to. I think it was very much an emergent topic. It was, as Jan said, it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity to do something different. You know, believe it or not, but we'd been emergent scholars at one point in time. We've kind of been find the benefit of kind of like people, somebody's kind of pulling things together in a single space. And so it was a idea. Then there was a basic structure. Then there was a skeleton, and then it kind of changed a bit. And then, as we were there, we made a decision to sort of say this shouldn't be a sort of a testament of the old. This has to be a kind of a living document that has to kind of inspire kind of people. And once we had that discussion, it was really easy to say, well, who's doing exciting work in this space? And forget people's CVs, forget people's stuff. It's who's doing the exciting work that will kind of hold together as a piece.
I also think there tends to be a very supportive community in this field, and getting people together to contribute then becomes easier. And I also think the timing of the book was absolutely crucial, both for the people involved at the so-called junior level and for more senior individuals like ourselves, given the various issues that are occurring now in both the business and the environment sector. Mm-hmm. And for me personally anyway, this book is an extension of going back to 1987, the corporate social reporting text produced by Gray, Owen and Maunders, which allowed new researchers to enter this arena, take up a book and get a sense of what was actually happening. Now, what was happening back then was much less than what's happening now, but hey, here's a text now you can pick up. It's hopefully clearly written, very accessible, and you can dive in straight away into various topics and areas and get a sense of what's going on.
And I would like to stress how enriching and how at the same time easy it was to engage with the different authors. They were very supportive, and we didn't get any no for an answer. So every author addressing a research topic that we consider was important to be included in the handbook was very supportive for the handbook. And I think that something that is also important for us is the fact that Rob Gray, Professor Rob Gray, was writing a prologue to the handbook, and we would like to present to offer this to the social and environmental accounting community as as something to remember Professor Rob Gray.
The way, 30 years of thinking about the intersection between accounting and the natural environment has led to some quite different ways of now seeing what we're trying to tackle. So oftentimes people distinguish environmental literacy from ecological literacy. So environmental literacy, if I take the case of carbon and climate change, would be figuring out a price of carbon and maybe putting it into a cost-benefit analysis and trying to figure out what you might do as a result of that. Ecological literacy in the same space would be interested in that as a technique, but would ask what reduction trajectories would be necessary in order to live within the capacity of the planet to absorb our emissions. So I think in the last 30 years, things have really moved on from what was very far-sighted concern about the natural world and what might be happening to the natural world, to a great flourishing of scientific insight about the way in which the Earth is a whole system, and that it's reaching a series of tipping points potentially, its capacity to deal with what we as human societies, with organizations as a mediating force in that situation, is getting quite problematic and complex. So I think the ecological literacy that I would hope that the book brings to people is that there are a series of techniques. There's a series of really amazing approaches to trying to deal with the environmental problems, but on top of that, we need to be addressing the questions in a way and at a scale that is going to be fit for purpose for where we find ourselves. So for me, that would be the difference from where we started at the outset. I think we've all become lots more literate in environmental problems, but then also literate in the fact that it's about the ecology. So the knowledge, skills and capabilities for humankind to live at peace with the planet, within a one planet capacity, but also to do so fairly and justly. So the social element has been core to that as well.
Well, the first thing I was trying to do is to offer a trajectory in theorizing in environmental accounting and reporting. That was the key idea. And I wanted the trajectory to begin with the whole notion of stakeholder accountability, going right back to the Gray, Owen and Maunders work at the very beginning, not the very beginning, but one of the beginnings of this particular field of study. And then to trace through what happened in the literature since then. And for me, it was brilliant because I actually learned so much from the process myself, having had to read so many papers that I'd missed over the years. And but one of the key things for me as well was to look and see what had happened since 2002, when Rob Gray had opined in AOS about the lack of theorizing in what he was calling then social accounting, but which was then very much intertwined with environmental accounting as addressed in this book. And just to understand how people had sought to understand, to make sense of the things they were studying over time, and how that sense making had enabled them then to deliver insights which could be used both in practice, but also to develop how we think about accounting and its links to the environment more generally. So that was my overall approach. I think what I was getting at there was, I was saying, well, wow, Rob Gray was quite concerned back in 2002. I'm overwhelmed now, having written this chapter. I don't know where I am anymore. Okay, and I was just trying to work out for myself. Okay, where is this leading us to? But I think, in one sense, though, what I was a little bit excited by was the fact that there's still potential for individuals in this area to develop their own conceptualizations, their own theorizations of practice in a kind of a quasi-grounded theory vein. We don't see as much of that in this literature. And given that it's relatively unique in some senses, although I would argue now it's a mainstream literature, or at least it should be in the financial management reporting vein, and we don't see as much of this, whereby individuals are, deriving conceptual ideas from their mass of data. Now, Ian alludes to this somewhat in his early chapter in the book as well, where he talks about the abductive process, which he recommends people go through when designing and implementing research studies. So that's really what, so in a sense, I wouldn't be as strong as to say I was arguing that there was over theorizing. There's quite a lot of theorizing, okay, often very, very excellent and elegant theorizing. I was more saying, well, maybe we should step back a little bit sometimes and ask ourselves, okay, what is it about this theorizing that we can develop further? And maybe also, without adding more complexity, be confident enough to say there's something, there are models or conceptions you can develop from these masses of data that are in themselves somewhat unique. Not for the sake of it, as I say at the very end of the book, not for the sake of it, because it might actually help us to think in a different way about the issues, but also add something original to our understanding of environmental accounting and reporting more generally. But I should say as well is that chapter for me was a labor of love, because actually it really did open me up to a lot of work I just hadn't had time to read. And having to write the chapter forced me to actually take a look at it. And I also, by the way, missed lots of work in that chapter, as I try and apologize for in some of my footnotes throughout. One
of the things I really enjoyed about the chapter is that it's the proximity of all these different theories. It's like an analogy. It's like having a really nice kind of like beer, but then going to whiskey, where it's all kind of like distilled together and all the flavors are there, and you get an intensity in the kind of I think in the whole first section there's a real intensity, and things are so it means you can actually see things together, and that kind of slice across is really, really unique. Because previously, you know, if you're a stakeholder person, you've read, there's hundreds of stakeholder stuff, and you would just kind of get drawn into a stakeholder rabbit hole, or a Foucauldian rabbit hole, or a dialogic rabbit hole. And what actually I think is really powerful is the fact that these things are all together. They're like strands, and you can actually see them, and you can experience, if you like, but through reading, the kind of the scope of different things, which then allows you then to, I think, to understand it. And I think it's about that informed choice. It's that, so that you're able to step back a little bit and look at all these kind of these different things together, you know.
I think also it's a sign of maturity as well in the actual field. There's a developing suite of studies which hopefully are building somewhat on each other theoretically and empirically. But what's really important about that first section as well, Ian, and it in some sense develops your point, is that we need to be in some senses conscious that this work doesn't ever get lost. Not my work or Ian's work or Carl's work or Jan's work, but the work in general. In the current trend towards large-scale data sets, large-scale modeling, using artificial intelligence, I'll say, for example, disclosures in this area, for etc., which is absolutely fine, but much of the time has no connection with or desire to engage with what's in this book. Okay, and this book is about making sure whatever happens in the research realm we're operating in, this work will not get lost, and will always provide that base if people want to delve into it. And I think given the way it's constructed, there's no excuse not to delve into it.
And I like chapter 4 in that respect, which is Ian's chapter on before research method comes methodizing, because chapter 3 and 4 read together tells you to slow down a bit and to think very clearly about what is the object of your research, what are you seeking to understand, and then to select, but not over-select, the right methods, the right theories, and the right development. And I really second that sense in which we all feel we have to, genuflect to some conceptual domains, when in fact some of the things that are going on are substantive and interesting in their own right, and they don't need to be over-theorized. But because the world as it stands at the moment is, well, it's too exciting to be fair, but there's a huge amount of opportunity to understand and contribute to a low carbon world, revitalizing our natural resources. Capital markets are starting to move in quite interesting ways to try to provide information about what investors are doing. So in that respect, if you like, it doesn't, I guess, yeah, and it's easy for me to say as a longer standing colleague perhaps, but actually to be more exciting in our design, in our theories and our ideas, and actually, you know, going for it in a bigger sense.
I think there's a little bit of I don't know, rebellious isn't the way, just being slightly, you know, kind of challenging and confronting, and not actually taking things as written as read, if you know what I mean. And I was always struck by when I went to talk to kind of people, and I thought, oh, your stuff's really clever, really coherent, and then they kind of tell you the story of how they made it up, how they had to fight people in their department, and now people that you're just going, oh, you just put their name and five numbers after it, and you go, that's all you need to do, as if everything came fully kind of formed. And it's very much this idea of starting to kind of I suppose it's a little bit like kind of Brendan. You kind of go back and you say, well, how did you do your research methods, Ian? How did you go about doing it? What was it that kind of made what made it exciting for you? And you know, and interesting that Jan says that, you know, the 3 and 4 fit together. But I mean, myself and Brendan discovered that we had accidentally stumbled across a really good kind of piece by kind of Swedberg, which was kind of before theory comes theorizing. And it's about this idea of changing things from a kind of like a noun or a story that somebody else has told into an active process that actually helps you with your work, helps you kind of understand what's actually going on. And I'd been doing a little bit of work on this, and suddenly realizing that actually, well, you know, we're doing all this stuff on theorizing, but nothing on method. And very much kind of like when you see method, it's very much almost like a bit like McDonald's. You go in and you pick from a menu, and you get the exact same thing every single time. And you know, it's relatively cheap and easy to do, but it's, you know, kind of like it's potentially destroying the planet, and it's ultimately kind of like lacks any utility or value. In that, you know, this idea that research methods is often seen as is really boring. I mean, people get bored with kind of method. You know, they sort of like they get obsessed with different types of stuff. When actually, it's a process of inquiry. It's like trying to find things out about something. And I mean, I think one of the interesting things is normally when you do the research design at the beginning, that's when you know least about a topic, which sounds really bizarre, isn't it? I mean, just like one of the great things about the Swedberg stuff about theorization is like you do the theory before you do anything. Really? You know, it's like, no, like we do the research design when you know least about a topic. And then when you know, and then you suddenly go, oh, I did it wrong. So it's this idea of flipping these things in its head and actually saying, well, you know, let's challenge the kind of like the stuff. Get yourself a research question, then get yourself do some reading, get yourself a research, design your research and find stuff out. And that'll work every single time. It's never worked for me. And I know Brendan wrote a long time ago with kind of Bill Lee and Chris Humphreys, the messy stuff that, when we're talking, your reflection on how you did your PhD and analysing all these interviews, and when you actually get that, how it kind of works, if you like, and what makes it work, often is missing. And that's really what we're kind of trying to do in this one here. But I mean, I think for me, there is a try and avoid over methodizing. Be strong, be kind of strong in your own idea, be courageous, look at the issues. But really, for me, the big thing is we need to be more domain driven rather than prior research driven, you know. And I think that's it. One thing I think that comes through from a lot of our research is we haven't got it right. We haven't. Brendan mentioned, you know, kind of like the big data. We haven't got it right. You know, some of our kind of methods are not there. Some of our data's not there. Certainly, the state of the planet suggests that we've not got it right. So we need to kind of dare to be different. And I think in particular, and certainly I think Carlos and Jan's stuff on bringing sustainability science into there and starting off with the sustainability, starting off with the science, and letting that unwind and see where it takes you. It doesn't mean you can't do it the other way. You know, really don't. You know, we need all these different angles to take it from. But does seem a space to let's start from the domain, and start working from there. But don't do your research design right at the beginning when you know least of a subject, and then you're surprised why it doesn't work. You know.
Yeah, I think that something important in the design of the handbook was, of course, taking stock of what we know about environmental accounting, but there is also at the same time this objective of opening up environmental accounting. We have. Like in part 4, we have this global to local perspective or local to global perspective, and we have in part 5 we have like emerging environmental issues and the answer that environmental accounting can give to those emerging issues. And there is, I think, in the handbook, this perspective that, okay, I mean, environmental accounting as practiced by organizations is something that we need to study, but environmental accounting is beyond what current organizations are doing, and we need to imagine the future of environmental accounting. And so this is a little bit the perspective for in chapter 6, the perspective when there is this idea of whether we need to adapt global socio-ecological systems or we need more profound transformations to deal with sustainability. And of course, I mean, this is an open issue. So the chapter 6 is providing a starting point maybe for this development in the future, and connecting with those the issues that were discussed before by Brendan, Jan, and Ian. There is this idea that for example, of theories. We have theories. We have been using theories, but those theories are patterns of interpretation that led us to the present situation. So probably we will need to be more, and supporting Brendan's argument, we need to be a little bit more courageous in proposing new theories, because I mean, if there is a future, the future is emerging from considering those changes, those transformations. So we need to participate, echoing Brendan's comments. We need to participate and provide some theories rather than importing theories to the field. And in this regard, I think that accounting has a very important role to play. I mean, I won't repeat the arguments that are in the handbook in different chapters about the need to consider topics of relevance like climate change in part 5, or oceans, agriculture, that are not usually seen in the environmental accounting literature, or think about socioeconomic arrangements that are not the corporation, are not the usual organization, like cities or supply chains or stock markets, or even entities of a smaller size, like I don't know, the fishing vessel in the fishing industry, and so on and so forth. But then if we think about what is needed for transformative, sustainable governance, then probably we will need to theorize accounting in novel ways, to think about how accounting can provide visibility about sustainability or unsustainability in different in new ways that reflect those issues that matter, that reflect those novel entities that are not usually in the the radar of environmental accounting research. And we will need also to have a look at the political implications, probably something that I mean, it's not so present, or when it is present in environmental accounting, it is approached from a very distant stance, which is the politics of the changes that are needed for a sustainable future that, in terms of population, in terms of I don't know, personal mobility, or in terms of which is very much related to personal freedom and mass tourism. And I'm speaking from Spain, so mass tourism is very important for the Spanish economy. But we will need to learn to live without mass tourism for a sustainable future, because it doesn't. I mean, unless we are convinced of the contrary, it's something that we need to investigate and see how accounting can participate for the governance of those profound changes that need to happen in the future for to sustain life, to sustain human life in the planet. So.
And Carlos, I know that you do a lot of work with scholars from around South America, and do you see kind of engaging with those communities that are not North American or European? Do you see a path towards the future that we're talking about here today, coming from engaging with those South American communities, but also engaging with them in a way that's not trying to exploit the knowledge and say, how do we just take these things out and put them over here, but actually engage with those insights, with insights that aren't Western European, North American, those kinds of insights that we're more familiar with inside of environmental accounting.
I mean, the so-called advanced economies, or the Western economies, are those who had led the environment to the current situation in the last centuries. So probably we need to learn a lot. And when I'm thinking about new theories, new ways, new patterns of understanding what is going on, I'm also thinking about ideas coming from the South. Currently I'm very interested in some ideas that are coming from Latin America. There is a sociologist, Santos, who is talking about the epistemologies of the South. So the new ways of, there is this perspective of decoloniality, about ideas about how to, contribute. It's not just to say, hey, we are here, but also to contribute to generate new ideas for everyone. And there is ideas about the growth, about this notion of the good life, rather than the life depending on growing, never-ending growth of resources needed to make us happy. So those ideas, I think, that are very important. And I'm just aware of ideas coming from South America, but I guess that in other parts of the globe there are some similar ideas developing. And in the handbook, there is the fourth part of the handbook is trying to deal with these new perspectives that are emerging in different parts of the globe. It's not. I'm sorry. It's not regions, because regions is like demeaning a little bit importance. It's parts of the globe, important parts of the globe.
I think that's important that we try and do in the framing is to look to the future and to generate things. And too often, I think we restrict ourselves to theory as explaining empirical facts or observations, rather than actually using theories to kind of project forward, which is one of their functions, and to actually to imagine. And I was in a seminar not so long ago in discipline and said, there's no future in accounting. And what they meant was, they didn't say there's no future in accounting. What they said is, when you look at accounting, it typically doesn't deal with the future. If it does, it only deals it in terms of catastrophe or ideas, or we wait until it's finished, then we pick apart the bones and say, here's how this economy destroyed itself. Oh, here's how this product actually ended up kind of wiping out a couple of ecosystems.
Yeah.
And I think that certainly one of the things that we need to maybe to do is to use this, is to also to start to frame the future, to think about it. And I really like the kind of, like, Carla said, this generation, we're generating knowledge, we're generating kind of ideas. And it's not just about documenting kind of past failures or problematizing, but let's use the kind of some of the theories and the ideas to work forward. And actually in that space there, because I think it's an area that's underdeveloped. And I think it was really kind of like that kind of chapter 6 is so important, because it actually kind of says, like there's another century ahead, there's another 2 centuries ahead, there's millennia ahead. It's not just about now, it's about something else.
I'm happy to start, and I'll be very predictable if you've read anything from me in the last 2-3 years. For me, it has to be a sustainability science approach, and that means that it's interdisciplinary. So you work with other disciplines to understand the nature of the problem. And on that basis, other disciplines are amazed by accounting when they find out about us, but mostly no one ever finds out about us. And so that's something maybe about our own insularity, but also maybe our own insecurity. So accountants have a huge amount of contribution to make in interdisciplinary inquiries into, whether or not, my case, the seafood industry, but there's so many places where more and better accounting would help. And then for me, it has to also be transdisciplinary. So and it might be just I'm no good at theory, maybe that's the problem, but in terms of actually starting in a world of practice and problems and opportunities to get to know what people need and to try to craft alongside them the things that would help them achieve better outcomes. And in that, I would then buttress that with theories and ideas and ways of actually achieving that outcome. So for me, that's the thing I really enjoy. And I totally get it's not for everyone, and it shouldn't be for everyone, because it's everyone has their own path to play through the work they like to do and who they like to do it with. But for me, I would hope that we'll see more of that, but also more self-confident environmental and social accounting scholars able to partake of those opportunities.
My reflections would be regarding how I'd like to see the whole issue of environmental accounting and reporting conceived of and enacted on in practice. And I'd like to see a situation arising whereby this is the mainstream, that this mainstream, non-mainstream separation becomes pointless, and that in a new generation of students, it becomes normalized. Not normalized in a way that neuters the difficult issues and the contentious issues, which is happening right now, I think, in some contexts, but in a manner whereby you're willing to engage with the issues, you're willing to understand how accounting impacts on the issues and how the issues impact on accounting more generally, in a financial reporting sense, in a management accounting sense, and in an assurance sense. So it's this sense of us not continually having to feel like a so-called other, in that, without, of course, being completely subsumed and normalized in a manner whereby everything becomes neutered and all becomes nice and gentle. It should never be gentle. It should also always be problematic. And I think that is something I think that may well happen in the near future, because some of the things that have happened in the accounting profession, however cynical some people might like to be, have been quite fundamental in the past 5 or 6 years, given what I was experiencing in a Republic of Ireland context back in the early 1990s. sorry, late 1990s, I'm not quite that old. But they're things that always come into my mind when I think about how this is going. Because when I do speak to individuals who are engaged in this area, it's almost like they are in some special club or in some special clique. Shouldn't feel like that. That should not be the way it is, because that's not going to evolve anything. Because you're going to end up in your little bubble, talking to each other and having a wonderful time, scratching each other's backs and agreeing on all the major issues, or not, as the case might be. So my idea is that if it spreads, becomes more engaging, brings more people in a challenging manner. That's somewhat idealistic, but I don't think it's unachievable in any way at all. And I think, you know, I shouldn't have to come to you, Matthew, and say, oh, Matthew, I'm a social and environmental accounting scholar. I'm an accounting scholar who happens to look at social environmental issues as part of my research.
And I absolutely kind of agree with that in terms of, I remember I was talking at an alternative accounting conference, and I'd actually done a little bit of research in terms of what people count as alternative accounts, you know, and these are things that most people consume. And I actually, there's sometimes a financial report, they're the unusual one, they're the least read. When we look at some of the accounting entities attached to, kind of as I talked about, we talk about cities or communities, we talk about our regulators, we talk about the products, we talk about the processes, we talk about issues that actually can concern us. And I think that these are the things that we encounter, and I see as trying to move away from the, you know, just purely the corporate entity as the only entity to look at things. It's a really important one. I did a strange thing. I discovered that there's about 45,000 listed companies in the world and about 300 million businesses. Yet so much of what we do focuses on these 45,000 kind of businesses that are nowhere near the kind of the things that actually kind of like that matter. They do are their seats of power, but one way to start to, you know, kind of like to unbalance this focus is to look at these alternative accounts, to look at these different ways, to look at what matters, and to provide good, strong, robust, compelling evidence based kind of like base kind of things of the kind of the some of the you know, the existential misery and the crisis that are actually being caused, but actually try to just open up our eyes to these entities, and how that then, and how we can use the, if you like, I suppose the kind of robustness and the power of accounting, accountability, assurance, all these things. And I mean, Jan mentioned something. It's really interesting that when you go talk to other disciplines, they come up with accounting and reporting as the solution. You know, more often than not, they want better indicators. They want better kind of values. You know, and we need to actually do that. So in the future, I think it's more about legitimating the kind of study of different entities. It's about trying to kind of like to look at different institutions. You know, expanding kind of beyond just simply that, you know, one dimension of it, and then to look at how do we get people to engage with these accounts, because it's all very well producing information. There's some kind of wonderful data out there on impact on systems, but nobody seems to be aware of it and nobody seems to be using it. So how can we make that appropriable into decision process and make it live and make it make a difference? Because I think one of the problems is we often stop at the let's measure things properly, let's value things kind of accurately, let's take into all these different factors. But sometimes we miss the factors. Who's actually using this and what difference does it make? So kind of like a flip into the stakeholder, which I think is back to where we started, you know, 1987, that kind of stakeholder thinking, and how can we make stakeholders really matter in sort of environmental accounting and accountability.
If I may just go back to that idea of interdisciplinarity for a moment, given what you were saying, Ian, and what you were saying, Jan. I mean, even if you look at the standard organization studies and management literature now, and how that's addressed corporate social responsibility and social reporting in the past 15 years as well, it's incredible the developments that have occurred there completely oblivious to what's gone on in the context of this book. And some of the individuals I speak to get quite surprised when I introduce them to work in this particular area. Now, there are exceptions to that in that field as well. So it's very, that cross-fertilization is very important. And as an anecdote, my last PhD student, I asked a professor of urban geography to be one of the examiners of the PhD. I knew of his work, a Dutch professor, a wonderful individual in the University of Amsterdam. And we brought him out for dinner before the PhD viva as well. And he just said, I had no idea that accounting could be so darned relevant and interesting. To a large, that's to a large extent to do with the students, but at the same time, you could really engage with the models, what was actually happening. And so you do get very surprised. But then again, I should say I'm a very, very big fan of the urban geography, social geography field in general. It's one of the most fascinating, complex fields imaginable, so sophisticated.
I will add something which is also important, I think, in the current juncture. Is okay, we are getting closer to science, and at the same time there is more and more or less and less trust in science in society. So I think that if I think in accounting, in environmental accounting in 20 years, I would like to see accounting playing a role in enhancing trust in science, in earth science, in socio-ecological system science, because I think this is massively important. I mean, we are seeing now lots of trends of people, denying the reality of the planetary boundaries and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that this is something also very important for the future to consider by environmental accounting scholars.
And now you know, Matt, why I wanted to write it with these three other gentlemen as part of the guide. I didn't know they believed half of those things. And so it's a real joy not to sort of finish a piece of work and rush off to the next thing, but actually to have a chance to have a conversation about it and a conversation with a broader array of people and just creating space for that conversation. So yeah, these are clever guys. We ought to take more notice of them.
With that, I'd just like to say thank you to Jen, Carlos, Brendan, and Ian for taking the time to discuss the handbook with me today. And thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you, Matt, for everything.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.